Dr. Muziwake Anthony Lembede, that great philosopher and awakener of the African youth of his generation, has written, "One who wants to create a future must not forget the past." An African proverb itself has long said, "When you fall, do not look where you fell, look where you slipped." Many people, with regard to this country, preach the gospel of forget the past, but where their issues are involved, they not only remember the past, but they commemorate it. In July 2014, I watched on television, rather painfully, when all European leaders met to commemorate the 100th anniversary of what they call the First World War. I did not see any African leaders invited to this commemoration. This is despite that in South Africa alone, 83,000 Africans were reportedly recruited for this European war. This was a very high number, which is when it is considered that the African population was not what it is today. Here in South Africa, on one occasion alone, we lost 600 soldiers. This was on the 5th. This was the 5th Battalion. They died when the SS Mendi ship sank on 21 February 1917. This was after it collided with the SS Darrow ship behind the front lines in France. I think the practice of dealing with symptoms in a national liberation struggle and taking them for the disease itself will destroy Africans in this country. Effects of a problem must not be confused with the cause from where they come. Causes of a problem must be identified and correct thinking applied to the problem. For instance, nobody in this country and in the world heard of the word apartheid until Colonial Prime Minister Daniel F. Malan coined this word in 1948. This word meant racism. Racism, however, was there in Kenya, in Rhodesia, in Nyasaland, Congo, and other African countries that were colonized. Fundamentally, the problem of South Africa was never apartheid or racial discrimination. In this country, we got involved in a colonial situation when our land was taken from us through the Berlin General Conference in 1885. That conference was critical for European colonization of Africa and looting the riches of the people of this country and of Africa continentally. It has been our custom to go to a country, and because we were stronger militarily, take and retain their possession of the country to which we had not lain. Another colonial settler who the British government had honored as Sir Andre Stockenstrom made the position of the colonialist in the African country as clear as daylight. He declared, the question of robbing Africans of their land is not whether it is right or wrong to plunder, massacre, and exterminate the Hottentots, the Kafirs. The simple reason is, will it pay? If the Bible and the missionary stand in the way of this 1,000% return, if in short, they cannot promote the great work of converting a nation of shopkeepers into a nation of millionaires, gunpowder will produce a more efficient gospel for the purpose of our system of civilization. Close quote. It is important to note that these two men had been honored by the British government as sirs. Indeed, for Africans in this country, colonialism reached a dilapidated level of idolatry. Its practitioners created a false myth of supremacy through which they turned themselves into demigods to be worshipped. South Africa is the only country that Britain colonized but never returned to its colonized owners. The other 15 countries which Britain colonized achieved independence dating from Ghana on 6 March 1957 to Zimbabwe, Southern Rhodesia then on the 18th of April 1980. In South Africa, Britain seized this country by force of arms. It later handed it to its colonial settlers on the 20th of September 1909. They are the people that now became negotiators with the Africans in Xhosa in 1993. That is why on the land question in South Africa, the issue of African land dispossession was wrongly handled in the present constitution. South Africa was never a state in international law. Article 4 of the Union of South Africa Act 1909 clearly states, and I quote, "The Union shall have full power and authority within the limits of the colonies." Article 6 provides that, and I quote, "The colonies mentioned in Section 4 shall become original provinces of the Cape of Good Hope, Natal, Transvaal, and Orange Free State, as the case may be. The original provinces shall have the same limits as the respective colonies at the establishment of the Union." The legal language is very clear. There is no national sovereignty created here or decolonization of the colonized Africans. It must not be forgotten also that South Africa illegally declared itself a republic. It must not be forgotten that also that South Africa illegally declared itself a republic after it was heavily criticized and boycotted by the whole world for the Sharpeville massacre. This had resulted from the uprising led by the Pan-Africanist Congress on the 21st of March 1960. This republic was illegally declared on the 31st of May 1961 by rebels such as Hendrik Verwoerd. Britain never suppressed this unilateral declaration of independence, which was in law a coup d'etat, just as it did not suppress the Ian Smith rebellion in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, on the 11th of November 1965. This absence of decolonization in this country by Britain consolidated colonialism, through which the African country was expropriated by European colonizers. That is why the policy that must now be implemented on the land question is repossession. It is repair. It is repossession, return, or restoration of land to its rightful owners according to population numbers, which include the Europeans who consider themselves Africans. Yes. African magnanimity, Ubuntu, Butu, demands this. Africans have never driven any human beings to the sea until they drove themselves there. It is European colonial settlers who expropriated African land from Africans. All that must be done now is justice. It is not surprising that G. Featured, who was a member of the Colonial Parliament in South Africa in 1910, is on record as telling his colonial colleagues, and I quote, "If we are to deal with the natives, that is Africans, in this country, then according to population numbers, we should give them 4/5 of the land."
The loss of land by Black South Africans is a deeply rooted issue that spans several centuries, marked by colonization, discriminatory legislation, and systemic racism. Here is an overview of how Black South Africans lost their lands. Arrival of European settlers. The process began with the arrival of Dutch settlers in 1652 at the Cape of Good Hope. The settlers, under the Dutch East India Company, started to occupy land traditionally inhabited by the Khoikhoi and San people, leading to conflict and dispossession. British colonization. The British took control of the Cape in 1806, expanding their territory further into the interior of South Africa. Both the Dutch settlers, also known as the Boers, and the British engaged in wars against indigenous groups like the Xhosa, Zulu, and others to seize fertile land. The 1930 Native Land Act. This was one of the most important pieces of legislation that dispossessed Black South Africans of their land. The Act allocated only 7% of the country's land to Black people, despite them being the majority population, and restricted them to live in specific areas known as reserves or homelands. These laws effectively forced millions of Black South Africans off their ancestral land, concentrating them in overcrowded and often infertile areas. The 1936 Native Trust and Land Act. This law expanded the reserve slightly but still confined Black ownership to 13% of the land, leaving the vast majority of fertile land in the hands of white settlers. It also established the South African Native Trust to manage the reserve, further entrenching government control over Black-owned land. Apartheid policy of 1948 to 1994. The apartheid regime, which officially began in 1948, intensified land dispossession through a series of laws that enforced racial segregation. The Group Act area of 1950 designated specific areas for each racial group, leading to the forced removal of black South Africans from cities and towns designated for white people. Bantustans. The apartheid government created Bantustans or homeland, which were intended to be self-governing territories for black South Africans. However, these areas were underdeveloped, lacked resources, and were economically dependent on the apartheid state. The creation of Bantustans further fragmented black communities and concentrated them in the least fertile and most remote part of the country. Labor reserves. The land disposition was closely tied to the economic exploitation of black South Africans. By confining them to reserves and Bantustans, the apartheid government ensured a steady supply of cheap labor for the mines, farms, and industries owned by white South Africans. Many black men were forced to leave their families to work in cities or mines under harsh conditions, further destabilizing black communities. Resistance movement. Throughout this period, there was significant resistance to land disposition, from early battles against colonial forces to organized resistance during apartheid. Movements like the African National Congress ANC and the Pan-Africanist Congress PAC fought for land rights and the return of stolen lands. Land restitution efforts. After the end of apartheid in 1994, the new democratic government recognized the injustice of the past and committed to land reform. However, the process of land restitution, redistribution, and tenure reform has been slow and challenging, with many dispossessed communities still waiting for justice. Thank you for watching. Do not forget to like and share your thoughts in the comment box below. Until next time, cheers and have a good one.